You know the scene, two men, a dusty street, hands twitching over six shooters at high noon. The truth? That almost never happened. And that's just the beginning. Because the hats, the food, the towns, even the outlaws themselves, Hollywood got nearly all of it wrong. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly why the quick draw was a fantasy, why most cowboys avoided cowboy hats, why the Pony Express barely lasted long enough to be remembered, and why some of the wildest towns actually banned guns altogether. But here's the catch. One myth wasn't just a lie, it was a cover-up. And you'll find that out later on in the video. The deeper we go, the stranger it gets. Laws stricter than you'd ever imagine. Weapons Hollywood never dared to show you, towns safer than their reputations, and outlaws who rewrote the rules entirely. Some of the most famous legends began with a lie, and the truth behind them is the 25 biggest lies about the Wild West. Most people will never know this story, but you will. Myth number 25. Every cowboy wore a cowboy hat. When you picture a cowboy, what's the first thing you see? The wide-brimmed cowboy hat. It's so iconic that the hat itself became the symbol of the West. But here's the truth. Most cowboys didn't wear them. Look at real photographs from the 1800s and you'll see something else entirely. Bowlers, derbies, even top hats. Hats that look more at home in a city than on the open range. And the cowboy hat we think of? That came later, when companies like Stetson marketed it as the hat of the West. And once Hollywood grabbed it, the costume became the reality. Which means when you picture the classic cowboy, you're not remembering history at all. You're remembering an ad campaign that was never meant to be taken seriously. If even the cowboy's hat was a myth, imagine what the rest of his life really looked like. Myth number 24. Cowboys lived on steak and whiskey. Ask anyone what cowboys ate and you'll probably get the same answer. Sizzling steak, washed down with a shot of whiskey. It's an image as strong as the cowboy hat itself. Strip away the Hollywood menu and you find beans, bread, and coffee. Day after day, meal after meal, the chuck wagon served up whatever was cheapest and easiest to haul. Beans, biscuits, black coffee. If you were lucky, maybe bacon or salt pork. Steak was rare on the trail. Fresh meat spoiled fast and cattle weren't driven to be eaten. They were money on the hoof. Killing one meant losing profit. Whiskey, too, was expensive, often watered down and far from a daily drink. So the Hollywood image of cowboys feasting on steak and whiskey every night, that was fantasy. The reality was monotonous, joyless food, the kind of diet that left cowboys craving anything different. Their food was bleak enough, but the truth about their pay and daily grind was even harsher. Myth number 23. Cowboys were free spirits living wild on the open range. The movies give us a romantic image of the cowboy, a free spirit, riding wherever the wind carried him, master of his own destiny. The record shows most cowboys were teenage boys working one of the hardest, lowest-paying jobs in America. The average cowboy earned about $1 a day. For that, he worked long hours in brutal heat, pouring rain and freezing cold, driving cattle hundreds of miles. Sleep was short, food was repetitive, and danger was constant. Stampedes, accidents, and hostile terrain. Freedom? Not exactly. Cowboys answered to ranch owners and trail bosses. They weren't outlaws or drifters, they were employees, bound to schedules and rules. And the Hollywood idea of the rugged adult gunslinger? Many real cowboys were just 15 or 16 years old. Kids with responsibility far beyond their years. So when we picture the cowboy as a romantic, free spirit, we're really looking at a teenager grinding out one of the toughest jobs on the frontier. The cowboy's freedom was exaggerated, and the people Hollywood erased from the story change it even more. Myth number 22. Cowboys were all white men. When Hollywood casts a cowboy, the image is almost always the same. A white man on horseback, riding tall under the western sun. It's so ingrained that many people never question it. What history makes clear is, a huge share of real cowboys were Black, Mexican, or Native American. Historians estimate that 1 in 4 cowboys was African American. Thousands more were Mexican vaqueros, the very horsemen who pioneered much of cowboy culture. Native cowboys, too, rode the ranges, often blending indigenous tradition with frontier work. So why don't we see them in the movies? Because Hollywood preferred its myth of the lone white hero. Whole communities of skilled riders, ropers, and trail hands were written out of the story. The cowboy wasn't a single race or background. He was America itself. Young men, often poor, often overlooked, bound together by brutal work. And if Hollywood erased entire groups from the cowboy story, it leads to an even bigger surprise: how cowboys really got around. Myth number 21. Every cowboy rode a horse. In every Western you've ever seen, the cowboy is inseparable from his horse. Rider and steed, partners across endless plains. Forget the Hollywood saddle, not every cowboy had a horse. Plenty of cowhands traveled on foot, worked from wagons, or rode sturdy mules instead. Horses were expensive, and a good one could cost more than a cowboy made in months. Ranch owners weren't about to hand out the best animals to low-paid teenagers driving cattle. Even on the trail, not every cowboy was mounted. Some drove supply wagons, others walked alongside the herd. Hollywood erased them because a cowboy without a horse didn't fit the legend. The horse wasn't the universal symbol of cowboy life, it was a privilege and sometimes a luxury. The horse itself was a luxury, not a guarantee. And the weapons cowboys carried will overturn even more assumptions. Myth number 20. Every cowboy carried a six-shooter. Hollywood wants us to think the cowboy's six-shooter was always strapped to his hip, ready for the next fight. The ultimate symbol of the Wild West. The evidence doesn't match the legend. Many cowboys didn't carry guns at all, and in most towns it was against the law. Frontier communities knew how dangerous constant gunfire could be. That's why towns like Dodge City and Tombstone posted signs at their limits. Hand over your weapons, or don't come in. Cowboys spent most of their time working cattle, not fighting duels. A six-shooter wasn't much use when your job was roping strays or crossing rivers. Some carried rifles for hunting or protection, but the idea of every man armed to the teeth was Hollywood fiction. The West was dangerous, yes, but it wasn't chaos. Gun laws were some of the first rules enforced, because without them, towns couldn't survive. The six-shooter wasn't the everyday companion we imagine. And the way Hollywood showed it being used was an even bigger lie. Myth number 19. Quick-draw duels at high noon were common. The classic Western showdown. Two men face each other on a dusty street, hands hovering over their holsters, the clock striking noon. It's the single most famous image of the Wild West. The duel itself was a myth, but the real twist is, quick-draw duels almost never happened. Most frontier violence was messy, sudden, and far from fair. Gunfights weren't about honor or timing. They were about ambush, advantage, and survival. If you waited to draw until the other man was ready, you were already dead. Historians can count on one hand the number of real, recorded duels. The truth is that bars, alleys, and card tables were far more dangerous than any staged street fight. Many gunfights ended before the second man even knew he was a target. Hollywood loved the showdown because it was clean, dramatic, and cinematic. But the real West was unpredictable, brutal, and often cowardly. The duel itself was a myth. But the real twist is who was actually pulling the trigger. Myth number 18. The Colt revolver ruled the West. In almost every Western, the Colt revolver is the weapon of choice. The six-shooter became a legend all on its own. Fast, deadly, and supposedly everywhere. What the gunfighters actually relied on were rifles and shotguns. The revolver wasn't the weapon that ruled the West. Shotguns and rifles were far more common, far more useful, and far more feared. Why? Because they worked. A shotgun at close range could stop a man in his tracks, or scatter a bar fight with one blast. Rifles gave cowboys, lawmen, and settlers the range and accuracy a pistol could never match. The revolver had its place, but it wasn't the universal equalizer Hollywood turned it into. More often, it was the backup, not the main weapon. So the West wasn't shaped by the quick draw of a revolver. It was shaped by the blunt, brutal firepower of rifles and shotguns. Which raises a bigger question. If the most famous weapon of the West was more myth than truth, what does that say about the men trusted to enforce the law? Myth number 17. Sheriffs were always heroic lawmen. Hollywood paints sheriffs as fearless defenders of justice, badges glinting in the sun, guns at their sides, ready to protect the innocent. But history tells a different story. The badge didn't always mean justice. Many sheriffs weren't heroes at all. Some were corrupt, some were incompetent, and some were outright criminals. Take Henry Plummer, sheriff of Bannock, Montana. He secretly ran a gang of road agents while wearing the badge. Or John Bean of Tombstone, often accused of siding with outlaws against his rivals. Plenty of lawmen bent the rules for bribes, ignored crimes, or enforced the law only when it suited them. The badge wasn't always a symbol of justice. It was often a tool of power, used to control or profit. Of course, there were honest sheriffs too, but they were the exception, not the rule. The myth of the noble sheriff was a Hollywood invention, smoothing over a much murkier reality. And if the law itself couldn't always be trusted, what chance did banks and stagecoaches have against the so-called outlaws? Myth number 16. Bank robberies were constant in the Old West. No Western is complete without it. Outlaws storming into a dusty frontier bank, pistols drawn, ordering everyone to the floor. It's one of the most recycled scenes in the genre. Strip away the Hollywood heists and you find real bank robberies were incredibly rare. In the entire 19th century, historians can only confirm a handful. Banks were small, guarded, and risky targets. The payout often wasn't worth the danger. The James Younger gang's botched raid on the First National Bank of Northfield, Minnesota in 1876 proves the point. The townspeople armed themselves, the gang panicked, and the robbery turned into a disaster. Most attempts ended the same way, badly for the robbers. Hollywood loved bank heists because they were dramatic and easy to stage. But in truth, the real frontier criminal was far more likely to target something else entirely. Stagecoaches carrying gold, mail, and passengers through open country. Which means the Wild West outlaw wasn't the slick bank robber we imagine. He was after much easier prey. Myth number 15. Stagecoaches were constantly robbed. Westerns love to show masked outlaws riding out of the hills, guns raised, shouting for the driver to halt. The stagecoach robbery is as classic as it gets. The evidence shows stagecoach robberies were far rarer and far less glamorous than Hollywood claimed. Yes, bandits sometimes hit a coach, but most weren't daring high-speed ambushes. They were quick shakedowns, often for a mailbag or whatever small cash was on hand. The famous bandit Black Bart, for example, robbed dozens of stagecoaches, but most of his hauls were little more than a few dollars and some letters. His reputation grew larger than life, but the actual robberies were often almost comical. The truth is, stagecoaches were inconvenient targets, heavily guarded routes, limited loot, and high risk of being caught. But Hollywood turned every coach into a rolling treasure chest under siege, which leaves a bigger myth still standing. If stagecoaches weren't as dramatic as we imagine, what about the trains? Myth number 14. Train robberies defined the Wild West. When you picture a Western outlaw, chances are he's robbing a train. Masked men boarding in the night, dynamite blasting the safe, sparks flying as terrified passengers look on. What the headlines don't tell you, train robberies, while more common than bank or stagecoach raids, were still rare and often failures. The first widely known attempt was in 1866 by the Reno Gang, who derailed a train in Indiana. After that, the image of the train robber took off, especially once Jesse James pulled his infamous jobs. Yet most heists weren't clean cinematic hits. Sometimes the explosives blew up the loot. Sometimes guards or passengers fought back. And most outlaws who tried it didn't get rich. They got hunted. The Pinkerton Detective Agency made careers out of tracking train robbers down. Hollywood turned the train heist into a near-daily frontier event. In truth, the real West had far fewer and far messier robberies than the movies ever admit. Which raises another question. If the robberies weren't constant, why do we still think of the Wild West as lawless chaos? Myth number 13. The West was pure lawless chaos. Hollywood loves to show the West as anarchy. Streets running with gunfire, sheriffs outnumbered, towns in constant danger, a place where law never reached. The evidence doesn't match the legend. Most frontier towns were surprisingly orderly, and violent crime rates were lower than many big cities back east. Tombstone, Deadwood, Dodge City, names we associate with non-stop bloodshed, often went months without a single murder. That doesn't mean the West was safe. There was violence, corruption, and occasional lawlessness. But the idea of chaos as the default? That was a Hollywood invention, built to make the frontier feel like a stage for constant danger. In fact, many towns posted strict gun bans, hired marshals, and passed local laws quickly to keep peace. They had to. Without stability, businesses couldn't run, and settlements couldn't grow. So the Wild West wasn't as wild as we think, which forces us to ask, if the towns themselves were safer than legend, what about the saloons Hollywood made look like non-stop war zones? Quick pause. If you've stuck with us this far, you're exactly the kind of viewer who loves busting myths wide open. So hit that subscribe button and keep going with us, because the biggest shocks are still ahead. Myth number 12. Saloons were constant brawls and shootouts. No image of the Wild West is complete without the saloon. Swinging doors, poker tables, whiskey flowing, and a fistfight breaking out every 5 minutes. The reality behind those swinging doors, most saloons weren't daily war zones. They were businesses, and businesses couldn't survive if customers were constantly getting shot. Many were rough, yes, and gambling disputes or drunken arguments could turn violent. But the majority of saloons were more about drinking, cards, and socializing than Hollywood chaos. Some even doubled as hotels, restaurants, or community meeting places. Owners wanted steady profit, not broken tables and bullet holes. Violence did happen, but it wasn't the endless nightly spectacle we see on screen. The saloon brawl became a movie trope because it was exciting, easy to film, and instantly recognizable. The reality? Most nights were dull, with cowboys sipping watered-down whiskey and complaining about beans. Which brings us to another legend of the West, the gambler. Myth number 11. Gamblers were always cheats and villains. Hollywood loves its gamblers. Slick mustaches, hidden aces, pistols under the table, always one card away from starting a gunfight. What Hollywood left out? Not every gambler was a villain, and not every game ended in violence. Gambling was everywhere on the frontier, from poker to faro to dice. For many towns, it was one of the biggest businesses, drawing crowds and keeping saloons profitable. Some gamblers did cheat, of course, but many made a living honestly, and some became celebrities in their own right. Figures like Doc Holliday were feared as gunmen, yes, but also respected at the tables. Gambling could elevate a man's status as much as it could ruin it. Hollywood reduced the gambler to a shady stereotype. The truth is, they were far more complicated. Sometimes admired, sometimes despised, but always woven into the fabric of Western life. And this opens the door to a bigger question. Were outlaws and lawmen really that different? Myth number 10. Outlaws and lawmen were total opposites. Movies love the clear divide, the noble sheriff versus the ruthless outlaw, good versus evil, badge versus bandana. The line wasn't clear at all. They were far blurrier than Hollywood ever admitted. Plenty of lawmen bent the rules, crossed sides, or had outlaw pass. Wyatt Earp, celebrated as a frontier marshal, was also accused of running gambling scams and sometimes working outside the law. Outlaws, too, could be surprisingly respectable. Some, like Wild Bill Hickok, lived on both sides of the badge. Others went from stagecoach robbers to hired lawmen once the politics shifted. The frontier was less about good versus evil, and more about survival and opportunity. The truth is, outlaw and lawman were often just roles that changed depending on who was paying, who was watching, and who was writing the story later. So, if the West wasn't a tale of heroes and villains, what does that say about the women Hollywood reduced to helpless damsels? Myth number 9. Women were helpless damsels in distress. Hollywood loves the image of women in the West as background figures, saloon girls, school teachers, or damsels waiting to be rescued. What the frontier really proves: many women on the frontier lived fiercely independent lives, running businesses, staking claims, and shaping communities. Pioneering women like Mary Fields, known as Stagecoach Mary, delivered mail on dangerous routes with a shotgun at her side. Others owned ranches, ran hotels, or built entire town economies while men were away. Even in notorious boomtowns, women weren't just scenery. They were shopkeepers, landowners, midwives, and sometimes even outlaws. Hollywood's damsel stereotype erased the fact that frontier survival often depended on women just as much as men. The West was as much their story as anyone else's. Women's power was erased from the story, and the same thing happened to Native Americans, whose history was rewritten almost beyond recognition. Myth number 8. Native Americans were just savage enemies of the frontier. For decades, Westerns showed Native Americans as nameless raiders, attacking settlers, circling wagons, little more than faceless villains. The stereotype collapses. Native nations weren't a single group of savages, but hundreds of distinct peoples with their own cultures, alliances, and histories. Some fought against U.S. expansion, yes, but others traded, allied, or even served as scouts for the army. They weren't mindless attackers, they were communities resisting invasion, or navigating survival in a changing world. The savage Indian myth came from Hollywood's need for a clear enemy, but the reality is that Native peoples were fighting for their homelands, traditions, and survival. Their story is one of resilience, not caricature. Native Americans were turned into villains, and Hollywood nearly erased another group just as completely: Chinese immigrants. Myth number 7. Chinese immigrants barely existed in the Old West. Watch 100 old westerns and you'll barely see a Chinese face. Hollywood made it seem like they were invisible or not part of the frontier at all. The forgotten truth: Chinese immigrants were everywhere in the West, and their work helped build the frontier itself. Tens of thousands came during the Gold Rush. Later, they became the backbone of the Transcontinental Railroad, blasting tunnels, laying track, and doing some of the most dangerous jobs white workers avoided. Chinatown sprang up in nearly every boomtown, from San Francisco to small mining camps. Chinese merchants, cooks, and laborers became essential to local economies. Yet when the work was done, prejudice and racist laws pushed them out of the very history they helped create. Hollywood erased them because their story didn't fit the myth of the lone white cowboy. But the real West can't be told without them. If Chinese immigrants could be cut out of the story so completely, the myth of the frontier itself deserves a second look. Myth number 6. The railroad tamed the Wild West. Hollywood loves the image. The railroad whistle echoing across the plains, iron tracks stretching into the sunset, taming the wilderness and bringing civilization with it. The Iron Horse didn't tame the West, it tore through it. Rail companies seized land through government grants, often displacing native communities in the process. Workers, many of them immigrants, were pushed into brutal, deadly conditions, blasting through mountains and deserts. Yes, the railroad tied the nation together. It brought settlers, goods, and commerce, but it also accelerated the destruction of the buffalo, fractured native territories, and handed enormous power to corporations that exploited both land and labor. The Iron Horse wasn't the end of the Wild West. It was the beginning of a new struggle, one Hollywood rarely shows. The railroad wasn't the triumph we imagine. And the same is true of the bigger idea that justified it: manifest destiny. Myth number 5. Manifest destiny was a noble idea that civilized the West. Westerns love to present the march westward as inevitable. Settlers carrying the flag, pushing civilization into empty land, fulfilling America's noble destiny. What really drove Manifest Destiny wasn't fate. It was power and profit. The slogan wasn't noble and it wasn't destiny. It was propaganda used to justify taking land, pushing native peoples aside, and claiming resources in the name of progress. The phrase made expansion sound like fate, but in reality it was policy, encouraging settlers to flood into new territory, often backed by violence and military force. It turned conquest into something that looked like destiny, when it was really about exploitation. Hollywood borrowed that myth wholesale, framing westward expansion as heroic and unstoppable. The truth is, it was messy, brutal, and anything but inevitable, which leaves another towering Hollywood myth to challenge: the Outlaws themselves, whose legends grew far larger than their real deeds. Myth number 4. Outlaws were larger-than-life legends. From Jesse James to Billy the Kid, Hollywood made outlaws into legends. Romantic rebels, gunslingers with style, larger-than-life figures who defined the frontier. The truth behind the legends is, most outlaws weren't masterminds or folk heroes. They were small-time criminals, often violent, often desperate, and usually dead before 30. Billy the Kid? Not a noble gunslinger. He was a rustler who killed men in disputes, not some heroic rebel. Jesse James? More a violent ex-Confederate guerrilla than Robin Hood. But dime novels and newspapers turned their crimes into spectacle, selling stories to a public hungry for adventure. In truth, many famous outlaws robbed little, died young, and wouldn't be remembered at all without mythmakers inflating their deeds. The legends lasted far longer than the men ever did. Hollywood took those exaggerations and supercharged them, cementing the outlaw as a cultural icon, which leaves us with an even bigger question. If even the West's most famous legends were exaggerated, what does that say about how the frontier really ended? Myth number 3. The frontier had a clear ending. Hollywood loves tidy endings. In their version, the frontier closed, the last gunfight was fought, and the Wild West rode off into the sunset. Forget the Hollywood ending. The frontier never had a single close. It faded unevenly, and the struggles of the West carried on long after the supposed finish line. In 1890, the U.S. Census declared the frontier closed. But did that mean the violence, lawlessness, and expansion stopped? Not at all. Native peoples were still being forced from their lands. Gunfights, range wars, and outlaw gangs still made headlines well into the 20th century. The myth of a clean ending was useful. It gave America a heroic story, a way to package the West as a completed chapter. But the real West didn't vanish on cue. It changed slowly, leaving legacies we still live with today. Which raises the question, if the West never really ended, what does that mean for the very idea of the Wild West we've been sold all along? Myth number 2. The entire West was wild. In movies, everything west of the Mississippi becomes one giant Wild West. Cowboys, outlaws, gunfights, and chaos stretching from Texas to California. Pull back the map, and you see, the Wild West was never the whole West. It was a short window of time and mostly confined to certain frontier zones. While Hollywood makes it seem like every Western town was Dodge City, the truth is most Western communities were farming villages, trading hubs, or quiet settlements where daily life looked more like hard work than gunfights. The myth stretched one region into a national identity. Hollywood exported Wild West imagery until it became shorthand for the entire American frontier. But the chaos and violence were the exception, not the rule. That exaggeration did more than distort history. It set the stage for the biggest lie of all. The West we think we know was built in Hollywood, not on the frontier. Myth number 1. Hollywood showed us the real West. For over a century, Hollywood has claimed to show us the West as it really was. Dusty duels, lone cowboys, lawless towns, and noble sheriffs. The ultimate lie is simple. The West we know today is Hollywood's creation. The quick draw duel? Fiction. The noble sheriff? Exaggeration. The outlaw hero? Mostly invented. Even the idea of the Wild West stretching across half a continent came from movie scripts, not history books. Real life was messier, quieter, and often stranger. Cowboys spent more time working cattle than firing guns. Towns passed strict laws to keep order. Women, immigrants, and native peoples carried stories Hollywood left out entirely. The Wild West we picture isn't a record of the frontier. It's a reflection of what storytellers wanted us to believe. A myth built to sell tickets, novels, and nostalgia. And that's why the biggest lie of all isn't just one scene or one outlaw. It's the entire West we think we know. So there it is, 25 myths shattered. And the Wild West you thought you knew turned upside down. The hats, the duels, the sheriffs, the outlaws. Even the idea of the Wild West itself. It was all part of Hollywood's greatest illusion. But now you know the real story. And once you see the truth behind the legend, you can't unsee it. If you want to keep digging deeper into the myths, lies, and stranger-than-fiction stories of the frontier, hit that subscribe button and join us for the next ride. Because Hollywood may have written the script, but history has the better story.